The underground bunkers beneath Tokyo's Imperial General Headquarters were dimly lit by humming fluorescent lamps. The air was heavy with August humidity as staff officers moved between communication panels, studying wall maps that showed how Japan's defensive lines were shrinking. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the atmosphere felt tense but routine. Reports from garrison commanders were expected. Updates on national defense plans were anticipated. Everything should have followed the pattern of 4 years at war. General Anami, Japan's war minister, walked through the command corridors with the confidence of a veteran who believed deeply in Japan's destiny. His stern features reflected the certainty of a man trained never to retreat. Yet something was wrong. Technicians checking inbound signals noticed that the Chugoku military district, responsible for Hiroshima, had sent no morning transmission, no troop reports, no civilian updates, nothing at all. Operators turned their radio dials again and again, listening for the usual crackle of communication, but only silence responded. One young officer, clearly shaken, stepped forward to report that all contact with Hiroshima had ceased at approximately 8:15 that morning. Every frequency, civilian and military, had simply vanished. Anami frowned. In the long years of conflict, cities had been burned, bases had been captured, and fleets had been sunk. But an entire urban center never disappeared without warning. Hiroshima housed a major army headquarters and a large civilian population. It had been functioning normally only hours earlier. What force could possibly erase all communication from more than 300,000 people in an instant? To understand the decisions of Japan's top leadership during those final days of the war, one must understand the mindset of the 6 men who believed they held the nation's future in their hands. They called themselves the Supreme War Council, though others referred to them simply as the Big Six. They were convinced that Japan still had the means to force a negotiated end to the conflict. General Anami, Admiral Soimu Toyoda, General Yoshijiro Umezu, Prime Minister Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa. These 6 leaders believed that if they made an Allied invasion unbearably costly, the United States would negotiate peace rather than demand unconditional surrender. What most people do not realize is that Japan had pursued atomic research long before the war reached its final stage. There were 2 separate programs. The Army sponsored a project under Dr. Yoshio Nishina, a brilliant physicist who had worked under Niels Bohr in Europe. The Navy ran its own research under Dr. Bunzaku Arakatsu. Both projects explored the theoretical possibility of atomic weapons, and both teams concluded that producing such a device required industrial power far beyond what Japan possessed. Scientists estimated that even a nation with unlimited resources might only be able to build 1 or 2 atomic bombs, possibly 3 after years of effort. That belief gave the Big Six a sense of confidence that the United States did not have the capability to produce such a weapon in meaningful numbers. When the first fragments of information arrived about Hiroshima, the leadership dismissed them as exaggerations. A reconnaissance aircraft reported that a small number of American bombers had dropped a new type of weapon, causing significant damage. Admiral Toyoda barely reacted. In his view, many Japanese cities had already been destroyed by FDR bombing. Considerable damage was nothing new, but the updates became increasingly alarming. No trains were entering Hiroshima. Every communication line remained silent. And then came a report from a weather aircraft that defied belief. A towering cloud, shaped like a mushroom, rising thousands of feet into the sky above the city. Shortly after, American President Harry Truman delivered a broadcast heard across the Pacific through intercepted shortwave radio. He announced that Hiroshima had been struck by a single bomb with the destructive force of more than 20,000 tons of TNT, and he identified it as an atomic weapon. The shock within the Supreme War Council was immediate, yet General Anami insisted that it must be propaganda designed to frighten the Japanese government, even if the Americans had achieved some version of an atomic device, he argued. Their own research made clear that mass production was impossible. Admiral Toyota supported him. If the Americans had multiple bombs, they would have used them sooner. It seemed logical to assume that this was a single, desperate attempt to force surrender. What these leaders did not know was that the Manhattan Project in the United States had mobilized 130,000 people, consumed the electrical power of entire regions, and created vast industrial networks dedicated solely to producing nuclear material. American capabilities had far surpassed the limits Japanese scientists believed were possible. As August 6th faded into August 7th, reconnaissance teams made their way toward Hiroshima. The details emerging from ruined streets were horrific and unlike anything the Japanese military had encountered. Still, the Big Six clung to their beliefs, unwilling to accept that the world had entered a new era of warfare. Dr. Yoshio Nishina, one of Japan's foremost nuclear physicists, was sent to investigate the site. He had spent years exploring atomic theory, calculating how such a weapon might function. Yet he had never imagined what it would look like when unleashed on a city. His journey south took him through a landscape that grew more disturbing with each mile. Trees stripped bare, poles snapped at their bases, a strange smell in the air. Eventually, the train could go no farther because the tracks ahead had been twisted into grotesque shapes by an unimaginable force. Nishina continued on foot. What he encountered shook him deeply. Entire neighborhoods had ceased to exist. Buildings were not merely crushed, they were gone. Streets were littered with glass, melted into puddles. People who survived wandered in silence, their skin peeling away, their bodies weakened by a form of sickness that had only existed previously in scientific theory. Shadows of men, women, and children were burned permanently into concrete walls, marking the final instant of their existence. Even before he finished his measurements, Nishina understood the truth. Everything he believed about the theoretical limits of atomic weapons had been wrong. The Americans had achieved something far beyond what Japan could produce, and at a scale he had never considered. But events were already moving even faster than he realized. While Nishina struggled to comprehend the devastation in Hiroshima, the Big Six in Tokyo reconvened to discuss the situation. They debated military strategy, possible diplomatic approaches, and the continuing feasibility of fighting an invasion. But on the morning of August 9th, as the council was finally addressing the reality of Hiroshima's destruction, an aide rushed into the meeting with a message that froze every man in place. Another city had been struck. Nagasaki had just been hit with a second atomic bomb at 11:02 that morning. The shock was profound. The earlier assumption that the United States possessed only one bomb collapsed instantly. If America had two weapons, then it could have more, perhaps dozens more. And if more existed, then the United States had no reason to fight a bloody invasion at all. It could simply eliminate Japanese cities one by one. Japan's entire defensive strategy became meaningless in a single moment. Even then, some leaders refused to accept surrender. General Anami, in particular, maintained that Japan should fight to the end. He stated openly that there was beauty in national destruction, comparing the idea to a flower falling at its most perfect moment. His poetic rhetoric stunned the others. He was prepared to watch the nation burn rather than accept defeat. But reality broke through in an unexpected and almost unbelievable way. On August 10th, Japanese forces captured an American pilot named Marcus McDilda. He had been shot down during a mission and knew nothing about nuclear weapons. However, under brutal interrogation, he invented detailed explanations in an attempt to save his life. He told his captors that the United States possessed more than 100 atomic bombs, that it could deploy several per day, and that Tokyo was next in line. McDilda's statements were false, yet they contained enough technical vocabulary to convince Japanese intelligence officers that they might be true. When the report reached the Supreme War Council, it carried the impact of absolute doom. General Anami read aloud that one atomic bomb produced the destructive equivalent of thousands of conventional aircraft. If the Americans could strike repeatedly, then no defensive strategy remained viable. The war could not continue. Still, the council became deadlocked. 3 members demanded surrender. 3 insisted on fighting. Japan faced annihilation while its leaders argued in a darkened room. And then something occurred that had not happened in more than 1,000 years. The Emperor of Japan intervened directly in a political decision. Late on the night of August 9th, Emperor Hirohito entered the council chamber, breaking centuries of tradition. The Big Six knelt as he spoke with quiet authority. He explained that the situation in Japan had become untenable. The suffering of the population had reached unbearable levels. The nation had no path forward except to accept Allied terms. He stated that Japan must endure the unendurable and accept the impossible. His words did what nothing else could. They ended the debate. The path toward surrender had been chosen. But the story did not end there. In the early hours of August 15th, only hours before the Emperor's message to the nation was broadcast, General Anami chose to die rather than accept defeat. He performed ritual suicide in his home. His final writing expressed loyalty to the Emperor and sorrow that he could not serve longer. He did not mention Hiroshima or Nagasaki. He could not acknowledge that the world had changed. Other Japanese leaders faced their own reckonings in the months that followed. Admiral Toyota, who had dismissed the possibility that America could produce multiple atomic weapons, reportedly stared for hours at photographs of the destruction after he learned the full scope of the Manhattan Project. What he had believed impossible had been accomplished on a scale that stunned even the scientists involved. The atomic bombings ended the war, but they also ended an era defined by traditional concepts of honor, sacrifice, and large-scale conventional warfare. Leadership scholars and military strategists study the decisions of August 1945 as an urgent warning. Knowledge can become a trap when leaders believe their expertise cannot be wrong. The Japanese military leadership understood nuclear physics. They understood the limits of their own industry. Yet that very understanding prevented them from recognizing that another nation had already shattered those limits. The tragedy of August 1945 continues to resonate because it demonstrates how leadership can fail when it cannot adapt to unprecedented change. Today, As new technologies emerge in fields such as artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, and space-based systems, this example remains profoundly relevant. Leaders who assume that the rules of conflict cannot change may find themselves facing consequences as catastrophic as those seen 8 decades ago. The story of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the decisions of the Big Six forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the greatest danger is not an external enemy. Sometimes the greatest danger is the belief that we already understand the boundaries of what is possible, even when someone else has already crossed them. What ideas do you take from this story regarding leadership, technology, and our willingness to question long-held assumptions? Share your thoughts, and if you found this compelling, make sure you hit the subscribe button and like the video. Your support allows more stories like this to be told.